Now, as we begin our class for today, let me revisit for just a moment that last thing we talked about. It was on your pop test about the seven sacraments. Why was that such an important thing in the church by this time? Does anyone know? The concept goes all the way back to the 2nd century. Yes, sir.
Because when they excommunicate them, when you get excommunicated, you can't partake in sacraments?
Yes, you're cut off from all of that. The original idea, going back to around 200 at least, and it kept growing in the church with time, is that the sacraments are the way that God's grace is dispensed to His people. And as the power of the bishops grew, they started using the power of the sacraments to extend or withhold it from people that they either felt like were out of fellowship with the church, or if they were less than scrupulous, that they were simply trying to exert power over. And so when that was withheld from you and you had been taught that and had known nothing else all of your life, it would be a very devastating thing, and therefore it was a very powerful tool on the part of the church to use the sacraments in that way. And yet that's not what they were ever really intended for, is it? Baptism, or even the ones that are actually biblical out of that, baptism, marriage, and so forth. That's never the way they're presented in the Scriptures. Rather, they are things that tie into relationship with God in one way or another. Baptism into Christ, marriage, you're entering into a relationship with another person that using something God had ordained at the very beginning of creation and that sort of thing. But to use it as a kind of weapon, as as someone said, they weaponized the sacraments. And that was never the original intention. And that'll be one of the things the reformers will work hard to try to change the way they looked at and taught others about the sacraments. They don't necessarily abandon the concept of the sacraments, but they change the emphasis of the sacraments. And so that's an important thing, I feel like, for us to know. Now, in our period of time today, the medieval church, we're just picking an arbitrary number with the 1054, with a divide between East and West. Now our study turns very markedly towards just studying the Western Church, not the Eastern Church. And certainly the Eastern Church has a history from AD 1054 until now, but we're just not looking at that part of it. We're looking at the Western half of Christianity, the European Church, that will eventually, part of it, become the American Church as well. And there's just so much in this period of time. The period we covered on Monday is sometimes, I said, called the Dark Ages, because until just recent years, we've been missing a lot of information about what even happened during some of those times. But we have exactly the opposite situation with this period of time from about the middle of the 11th century, 1054, up until about 1500, and that's just a random number almost to pick. The beginning of the 16th century roughly is where we're going to. 450 years, there is so much information about this period of time, it's hard to know what to emphasize. And so every historian and every instructor of this period of time picks and chooses just what they can. And so our author did in his book. We commented that he scarcely does more than just touch on the Crusades, and yet that was a major, major thing going on during the first part of this period of time. And once the church, for the first time, took on a military aspect, as it did in the Crusades, for the next several hundred years, in fact, all the way into the Reformation, there will continue to be crusades. None of them as large or as spectacular or as effective, if effective is what any of them were, as the first 4 or 5 were. But we'll even find some of the early reformers going on crusades of their own against others using basically military action to attack those who believed differently than they did and practiced differently than they did. It's not easy to get out from under a certain way of thinking about something if you're born and raised and that's all you've ever known. And so that's what was happening with them. If you've gone online and seen the notes up on the website already or got those, I just gave you at the beginning of the notes, and we don't need to cover this, what some of the different historians I look to and how they divide up this period of time. Dr. Oakes and his Christian story, or Dr. Ferguson and his church's history. They each sort of break this up a little differently or emphasize different things themselves that stand out about this, or even Dr. Maddox and his The Eternal Kingdom. But my characterization of this period is roughly along these lines. And again, this is in the notes you'll receive. First of all, we're going to enter into a period of time where the popes are going to range from brilliant to awful. And sometimes from one to the next, it will be just the opposite. And we will see the church struggling during this period of time on how to deal with that problem, and also even to deal with who chooses the popes. It'll be during this period of time they will pretty much finally nail down, towards the end of this period of time, the same method being used today to select the new pope. When the previous one retires, which only a few have ever done that, but after he dies, for the rest of them, and then they want to replace him with another. And we'll see some of these men who are no more qualified to be pope than I am to be president. In fact, I'm probably more qualified than they were. But it was strictly political, or it was strictly a power play. And because the church was the most powerful organization in most of Europe, especially during the first half of this period of time, then powerful men, or men who want to be in positions of power, fought to become pope instead of president, king, or something else. And so that's a sad thing that marks this period of time. But there's going to be increasing conflict as the feudal system starts giving way to first a city-state, that is, large powerful cities that has a ruler over them that extends its power out around that city, and eventually those city-states become nations. There's going to be increasing conflict between the city-states and nations with the papacy, because no man can serve two masters. You're going to love one and hate the other, or something, you know. And so pretty soon, both the papacy and these rulers of these states, nations, both see the conflict that's there. And the Pope will try to raise up and put down those who are ruling over some of them, and eventually the roles will be reversed, and the rulers of some of these states, like in France in particular, will actually be the one who will raise up and put down popes. They'll be his hand-picked choices for pope. So we're seeing the conflict between church and state, a conflict that is sort of reminiscent of some of what we see today, even in our culture, where, you know, in our culture we have a sort of an uneasy relationship between the church and the state, and that very much became the case there. This is going to be the period of the Crusades. And there's some good things you can say about the Crusades, but in general, I think most of us would find it appalling that they would ever even taken place.
Right.
But there are a lot of interesting things that come out of that, and we could spend 2 or 3 class periods just on the Crusades. In fact, I've put up on, if you go to the church history section of Sunset Online, where you have stuff, I've put up 2 videos up there. It's 2 hours, I believe, of video. Each one is 1 hour long, produced by the History Channel, and on the Crusades, the Cross and the Crescent. And while, you know, I don't necessarily agree with or feel like they're objective about everything they say there, in general, they seem to have a well-balanced approach to this. They have both Islamic scholars and Christian scholars and some scholars who are neither, all contributing and talking about this period of time in history. So if you have 2 hours where you're not doing anything better, you might want to go watch that. I think you will enjoy it. You are not going to be tested over it, but it's there for your resource. Yes, sir.
If we happen to take a page or two of notes during that, can we get some extra credit?
Well, I don't know about extra credit, but I would certainly think if any of you were the ones that drew the Crusades as your topic, you might certainly find this a handy resource for your paper. We're going to see calls starting to be made in various parts of the church in the West for reform. It's not just us looking back 500, 600, 700 years saying that's awful. There were people actually living then and there who were saying this is awful. This needs to be changed. And this is going to be a time when we're going to see the earliest efforts to try to bring about reform. The church did not usually take that criticism well. People were executed. People were imprisoned. People were exiled. People were silenced. And again, the church has become the product of its own past with this continual building of a hierarchy with all authority centered at the upper echelons of it. That doesn't leave much room for input from the bottom. And that's something we always need to be afraid of in God's church today. Part of, God's church we're a part of. That we don't somehow in our congregations or eventually in our brotherhood make it where that the ordinary member of the church can no longer say, I don't think this is right. But nobody listens to them, and more than that, they actually try to silence them. But that's going to be happening during this period of time. The church in the East, the Eastern Orthodox Church, is fairly static. And I even use the word stagnant during this period of time. They change very little during this 450-year period. There's not much difference between the church in the East, or the Eastern Orthodox Church in 1050, and the church in the Eastern Orthodox sector of the world in 1500. They still look just alike over that whole period, while the church in the West changes a great deal. It's going to be a time of great missionary efforts. As we said when we first began this whole study of church history, it would be real easy just to focus on all the things that went wrong, and all the things that looked bad, and all the mistakes that were made, and never give credit for all the great stuff that also happened and the good things that came about. This is when the church is going to go ahead and codify a lot of its doctrines and practices that we saw already rising up in the previous two lessons, starting all the way back to AD 200 in some cases, coming right up through that early Middle Ages of last Monday. They're going to go ahead and codify and have church councils and issue all sorts of papal rulings and council decisions about things having to do with penance, the sacraments, things called lay investiture. That lay investiture means who gets to appoint just a common little priest in the little town or in a small village. Who gets to appoint him? Does a bishop? Does the church in that place? Does the ruler of that area, politically, the ruler? Indulgences will become a big thing in the church. Indulgences where they actually sell forgiveness. Sometimes even before the sin's been committed. The church will use that for a number of things, for wielding political power, for raising money and other things. This is when the doctrine of transubstantiation. Do you know what that means? Mm-hmm. It's talking about the Lord's Supper, or as they would now be calling it, the host, the Mass, or the Eucharist. When they finally start demanding all across the Western Church the belief that whenever the bread is taken or the cup is taken, that while on the outside it remains bread or wine, on the inside, it actually transforms into the body and blood of Christ. That it's not just representative, it's actual. And that's still the view of the Holy Roman Catholic Church today. And it'll be a major sticking point with the Reformers. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Zwingli got together, and there was one, Melanchthon, I believe, was the fourth, when they had this big meeting about 20 years after the Reformation began to see if they could all agree on a common thing. And they agreed on everything but one subject, the sacrament. They had different views. Martin Luther believed to his dying day that when the bread and the wine was taken in the hands of the priest and the thanks was given, that it changed into the literal body and blood of Christ. It is said that while they were all sitting at the table and three of them believed one way, they all believed it was just representative. Two believed it was representative. One believed that they existed side by side, that somehow mystically the body and blood of Christ were present in it, but not actually so. And Luther believed it was actually so. And after they had gone round and round about this several days, and Luther actually takes out his pocket knife and carves in the wood of the table he's sitting at, and basically said, "It still says, 'This is my body.'" That's what he was going to stand on. You know, that was his argument about it literally changing into the body of Christ. But the church makes that decision long before Luther, that's going to be the official doctrine of the Catholic Church. And we've already mentioned that they'll struggle on who and how and when the next pope will be selected when it comes time to do that. And so with some apologies to Clint Eastwood, this is going to be a great period of time for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to have all of that in spectacular ways during this period of time. But I want to take a few moments to point out some things in your textbook that I'm often fascinated by little details. Sometimes they give us some insight into some other things. So if you happen to have your textbook with you, by the way, did you find yours? All right, thankfully. Otherwise, we might have had to take up a contribution so you could buy another one. But on page 78, which is again one of those pages that says this is looking forward to what's going to be in the next chapter. But there on page 78, if you look in the first section at the top where it says, talks about Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is the head of the Mongol peoples. These are the people that live north of China today in Mongolia. But they were spread out a lot further. They were much more powerful people then than now. Part of them were the Mongol hordes and other things, that swept across the central part of Asia and conquered large territories and so forth. Very powerful people at one time. And part of the reason it's thought the Chinese probably built the Great Wall of China was to keep them out, to protect themselves from them. An ancient version of the immigration wall. But just look at the little section they have here. It says Marco Polo, this was a European man who traveled all the way to China and kept a diary of his adventures on that. And when he came back to Europe, he actually wrote a book that for a time when printing hadn't been invented yet, and so all books were made by copying by hand, it literally was a bestseller all over Europe when he came back, because people are hearing about a land they knew nothing about and a people they had never known about before. And so he sees the Chinese, but he also meets the Mongol peoples. So it says Marco Polo's father, who was actually the first one to travel to China, even before Marco Polo did, met Kublai Khan in 1266. Christianity so intrigued Kublai that he asked for 100 monks be sent to teach his people, the Mongols. Fewer than 8 monks were willing to go. When the trip became severe, all of them turned back. When monks finally reached Mongolia in the late 1200s, about 30 years later, the Mongols had already converted to Islam. When you hear the call of, to go preach the gospel somewhere, maybe you'd better not put it off. That might be from God. The Macedonian call isn't just in the New Testament. It still happens today. There's several events like this in church history where a people ask established Christianity to send someone to teach them the gospel, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't happen. And then those people, when finally the gospel does get there many, many years later, they've already converted wholesale to something else entirely. So that was one thing that really stood out to me that is just stuck in here. Just kind of interesting thing. Then there's the Waldensians. I believe they're talked about on page 86. The Waldensians are named after a man named Waldo. That's probably the anglicized version of his name. Valdez is how he's often known in Italy and France and so forth, but in the West we say Waldo. He was from Lyon, a city in France. And it tells us there on page 86, in 1173, a street corner singer staged a play about a nobleman who gave away his wealth. That was a common thing. Even today, if you go to big cities, you'll sometimes see musicians or mimes or others that outside the subway stations or on street corners doing things for a little donation of some kind. That's an old and well-established practice. Probably even, I'm trying to think of a better word than that, but that will do fine. But that's what's happening here. The play so impressed a French merchant named Waldo or Valdez that he committed himself and his wealth to Christ. He funded a French translation of the Bible and became a mendicant. Mendicant, I don't know what the word mendicant means, but I know what they're talking about. They became traveling preachers. They would go from village to village, town to town, carrying the message of the gospel. They were mendicant preachers. Yes,
so would that
Edmund?
be like our version of itinerant preachers today?
Yes. I think that'd be that, or even if they were going to establish churches, we'd just call them, in the old days, circuit riding preachers. Or they'd go from one to the next. But it says Waldo became disturbed as he studied the Scriptures. And what disturbed Waldo? He found no references to purgatory in the Bible. Remember, he's translating the Bible out of the Latin Vulgate into French, so it would be in the language of the common people. He was so interested to know that people could hear the Word of God in their own language. But clearly he had never had the opportunity before to deeply study it himself. Until he went into the priesthood and so had access to the Scriptures as a priest. And so as he's studying the Scriptures, translating, he starts to realize he's reading things in the Scriptures that is different than what's going on in the church. And he found no references to purgatory in the Bible, even though he had been taught that this place definitely existed. More disturbing, he found no references to the Pope and his supreme power. As a result, Waldo rejected both ideas, which of course means he started preaching what he was believing. And Waldo's fresh focus on Scripture soon attracted a band of followers. They called themselves the Poor Folk of Lyon. All poor folk, with capital letters, including women, learned the Scriptures and shared the gospel in the language of the common people. Within 4 years, the so-called Waldenses of Valdoie could be found throughout France. Waldo asked the Pope to approve his movement. Not much of a chance of that, would you think? Yeah. The Pope agreed with one condition. Poor folk could only preach when a bishop asked them to preach. 3 years later, Waldo preached in Lyon without an invitation. The poor folk were thrown out of Lyon.
How dare he do that?
A few returned to the Roman Church. The remaining Waldenses ignored the Church's condemnation and kept preaching. When he died, Waldo remained under the condemnation of the Roman Catholic Church, And at the Fourth Lateran Council, Innocent III reiterated the excommunication. By the mid-1200s, this was happening in the late 1100s, by the mid-1200s, the Inquisition began working to destroy the Waldensians. Hundreds of poor folk were executed by crusaders. The church actually launched a crusade against these people, treating them the same way they did the Muslims in around Jerusalem. The remaining poor folk fled to Germany and Spain. But this is one of the earliest clear efforts to bring about some change and reform in the church, is the Waldensians.
Brother,
Yes, sir.
you know, as I hear that, it almost makes you want to like rip and remove the word church from how it was being used.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like,
Uh-huh.
because surely you're not representing the church of God, the flock of God, the one that Christ died for. You know what I mean? And so every move that, interesting, every move that was going to cause Reformation to get us back to New Testament as close as possible, right? It was either buffeted against with the Protestants or war or bishops or government at the time, and so
Yeah, all sorts of things like that. Another person that pops up in our book, and a very important person, is on page 97, and that's John Wycliffe, an Englishman. But going back to the, what is that period of time? Is it 1300s, I guess? Or maybe early 1400s. I forget exactly the dating. Late 13, early 1400s. He was actually a professor at Oxford University. That gives me the chance to say that this period of time is a period of time of the rise of the university in Europe. Most universities began as schools being run in churches. But then with the rise in the interest of scholasticism, then they started formalizing that, and eventually it formed the universities. In both, this would be on both the continent of Europe as well as over in Britain. I listed I think I listed a few of them on the last page of the notes here. The University of Bologna, and that's no baloney. University of Paris, University of Modena, University of Palencia, University of Cambridge, University of Salamanca, University of Montpellier, University of Padua, University of Toulouse, University of Orleans, University of Siena, University of Valladolid, University of Northampton, University of Coimbra, University of Pisa. And that's all just before we get to 1300 until we get to Pisa. So by the late 1100s, early 1200s, we see these universities starting to form, and the church was using men from these schools as, priests. In fact, many of them were priests or monks or bishops who were actually teaching in these early universities. They did not see any distinction between a good higher education and the church. It was often a tool or means of the church, and a good tool to have more educated men serving the church through these things. But Wycliffe, from the University of Oxford, which was one of the very earliest universities, it tells us about him. It says he's a philosophy professor at Oxford University in England. According to the Roman Catholic Church's teachings, only the true church could correctly understand the Scriptures. Wycliffe agreed, but he derived his definition of the word church from the New Testament instead of current church tradition. Now, he argues that the church are all believers. So that all believers, in that sense, the church has the right to interpret the Scriptures. The next logical step for him then, well, if the whole church has the right to interpret the Scriptures, how can they do that unless you put the Scriptures in their hand? And how can you do that unless you translate it out of the Latin
Right, put it in the.
and put it into the common language of the people. And because he was English, this would be a very early form of English, sort of the language of a later generation, Chaucer, and so forth, long before Shakespeare. So Wycliffe claimed that the church wasn't built on popes, priests, or sacraments. The church consisted of every person called by God to faith in Jesus Christ. And how could people know if they had faith in Christ? A godly life provided the best evidence, not the blessing of the Pope or taking sacraments or anything like that, but a godly life would be the proof. Every church member should, Wycliffe taught, strive to understand the Bible. That's why Wycliffe's followers translated portions of the Scriptures into easy-to-read English. Christ taught the people in the language that was best known to them, Wycliffe wrote. Why should people today not do the same? Some English people call Wycliffe a hero. Church leaders called him a heretic. Twice they tried to put him on trial. Political problems and natural disasters prevented both trials. Wycliffe died of a stroke in 1384 while still in good standing, officially at least, with his church. And someone here has Wycliffe's name, so you'll be writing a research paper on him. After he died, Wycliffe's followers finished his translation of the Bible. It was the first English translation of the Bible in its fullness. There was an earlier partial translation of just a few books of the Bible done back in the 800s or 900s in England, but I know part of the Psalms and maybe one or two of the Gospels and so forth, but not the whole Bible. So throughout England, they shared Wycliffe's message of reform. Their friends called them the poor preachers. Their enemies called them lollards, a word that means mumblers in Dutch, and darnel weeds in Latin. Basically, whether you took it as English or not, mumblers meant that their critics were making fun of them for speaking something other than the official church doctrine. And those who said darnel weeds, that basically was the same as saying, well, they're just like dandelions. They're not good for anything. They just spring up and spread stuff everywhere. But mumbling weeds they may have seemed, but their mumblings would soon shake the world. Wycliffe's words quickly traveled beyond England and crossed back and forth across Europe. Around 1400s, his ideas began to take root in Bohemia, a region in the lands now known as the Czech Republic. Roman Catholic bishops in Bohemia banned Wycliffe's writings, but Jan Hus, a brilliant Bohemian professor and priest, had already embraced Wycliffe's ideas. The encounter would cost Hus his life. Hus began to proclaim Wycliffe's understanding of the church and the Scriptures from a pulpit in Prague. In 1407, the church revoked his right to preach. Hus refused to hush. In other words, he just moved outside the church and kept preaching. He claimed that people should obey the church only when the church agreed with the Bible. And that, in other words, the Bible had more authority than the church did. And the short form of this is eventually the king of Bohemia promised to protect Hus if he would come to a church council meeting and defend his views. But when he got there, the king reneged on his promise, and Hus was condemned and burned at the stake. And while they were at it, they gave orders to go dig up the bones of Wycliffe, who had been buried more than 30 years before, and go ahead and burn them at the same time. That'll show him.
Can't be in the resurrection of the dead.
Burn his bones too?
Do what? Yeah. Even though the man had been dead for more than 30 years. When,
hold on. Where you read that?
well, the part about, that's going to be on page 98 in the book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what they're saying.
The word Hus, as I recall, in the Czech language of that time, meant goose. And Martin Luther, as part of the reform, that he helped lead, he knew that it was a real possibility the same thing could happen to him and those who followed him. And he started making a joke about John Hus. His goose was cooked. And that same might happen to them. And we have this expression, of course, in our language even today, 600 years later, But it all goes back to John Huss being burned at the stake. The goose was cooked. That's how the critics would put it. So,
Wow.
yes, sir.
I have my assignments on the Waldensians.
Yes.
So I was looking at them, and also you see it with Wycliffe. Every time I think it just shows the power of the Word of God, because the Catholic Church didn't want to let it out. Every time someone tried to translate it into the common people's language and anything that would oppose them, they destroyed them as quick as they could. And
Yeah.
you can't do it in the language of the people. Only we can understand it.
Yeah, they could speak Latin by that time, so then they'd tell the people what they felt like they should know.
They had all
So.
the power because they controlled the Word
Yeah.
of God.
And again, realize that wasn't every priest and every monk,
Right.
but that was the official stance of the upper echelon of the church.
The elite. I mean, it's so much like Acts, right? It's so much the gospel, wanting to speak to the common people of the time, and setting the captives free and the oppressed, right? And the Lord choosing all people, inclusive instead of exclusive. And every time we see the enemy working through people, power, prestige, property, etc., to try to prevent that.
Yeah.
And so,
Satan keeps creeping right back into the church, doesn't he? Or in among God's people, let's say.
But I think it gives, going to the class with you, it gives me a very good, like, here is I'm going to build on a platform, I'm going to take that all the way through so I can answer and have a response to those who always say, well, do you know what the church did in this era? They killed people, yada, yada, mistranslates, and it's all wrapped up, you know what I mean? But we can always go back to what we're talking about. So,
And while we're talking about weird things that come down to today in forms we don't know, did you read the section about the bubonic plague sweeping through Europe? And I mean, the estimate is more than 23 million people died. And Europe wasn't nearly as populated then as it is now, but that was a significant 23 million. That probably was half to two-thirds of the population was killed in the bubonic plague in a period of about 4 to 5 years.
4 to 5, 23 million.
Yeah. But I'm old enough because I can remember when I was a child, I grew up in a small community. We had a little country schoolhouse, grades 1 through 8. And I can remember I just thought it was some kind of a nursery rhyme or something. The little girls would be singing, "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy." And then to find out that actually goes all the way back to the bubonic plague and their roseated bright red cheeks when you would get the disease. And so they call that roseated.
Wow.
And because of the smell of death everywhere, people, would put flowers or something in their pockets or something else that would sort of mask a little bit the smell of death everywhere. And they all fall down is when people were dying. Plop.
Crazy the stuff we sing, right? I remember that song.
During the break, we'll have you perform it for us in rap, if you wish.
You
But
give me the song link.
okay, but just those little kind of things. And the reason I mentioned that is, years from now, you may not remember most of what we talk about in this class, but you'll probably still remember his goose was cooked and ring around the rosy now. And but consider some of the things, the good, the bad, and the ugly. First of all, the Crusades themselves. That's a whole separate subject. So the issue was that once Islam had swept into the land of the Holy Land and they'd captured Jerusalem and all of the so-called Holy Land in the 700s, and had built their mosque and their Dome of the Rock on top of the Temple Mount and so forth. But for a great long time, there were still pretty congenial relationships between the Muslims who now occupied this land and the Christians, both from the east and the west, who wanted to come there and visit. And as the church continued to put a greater emphasis on people making visits to sacred sites as a part of penance or other things like that, that traffic kept increasing. And then with the gradual improvement of the economic conditions in In Europe, after the AD 1000, a few people started to have more money. There was a rise of the middle class going on. More people are going over there. Soon, you know, some things official and some things unofficial started happening among the Muslim maintainers of that land. Unofficially, many Christians were being attacked and robbed of their wealth. Because it took, you know, you had to carry cash money on you when you were making a long journey like that to pay for everything along the way. And so they would be met practically on the borders and robbed of everything they had by Muslims, or at least they were accused of being Muslim. And then if you managed to get by that, when you got to some of these sacred sites, got to Jerusalem, wanted to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, wanted to go to the Church of the Nativity, wanted to do other things like that, you discovered just like in a modern amusement park or Disney World or Epcot or something, they charged high prices to let you in. They had an entrance fee for doing that. And these two things started causing more and more Christians in the West and the church leaders to complain. And then all sorts of negotiations had gone on between East and West to ease the situation, and things would get better, then they'd get worse. Finally, we have this Pope in AD 1095 that says it's time we take this land away from these heathens. You know, that we need to take back the Christian lands. And he even argued that there were Christians who lived there, and there were some Christians who lived in these lands of the Holy Land, who he said they're calling out for us to come deliver them.
Oh.
And he gives this speech before a lot of very powerful men, and the people start chanting, "God wills it, God wills it." And so then begins an effort to raise essentially an army when there really wasn't any kind of standing army in Europe at that time. Just these powerful men who had the knights of their round tables and so forth. And so they put together a hodgepodge kind of army, maybe as many as 20,000 men altogether. Not all of them were fighters. A lot of them were servants and others that they carried along, those who could, you know, blacksmiths and so forth, to shoe the horses and make more swords and all that sort of thing. You know, you got to carry everything with you. And this is combined with the fact that even the patriarch in Constantinople had asked the Pope to help him make access easier to the people in the East to the Holy Land as well. And so they're going to be combining their forces with the people in the eastern part of the church, the Orthodox Church. And so they go in and you know, it's a pretty wicked, bloody thing. Many of these guys that go in there and fight, they don't ask, they don't say, "Are you Muslim? Cut off your head." They just say, "If you're on the other side, you must be Muslim." And so Muslims, Christians, Jews, those who profess no religion at all died. I mean, they just killed everybody.
Tell me who was doing that again?
Well, the Pope is the one who called for it. And what was his name? Is it Urban? Yeah, that was one of the Urbans.
The western side?
From the Western Church, yeah, from the Western Church. But they join up with some troops from Constantinople, from the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Byzantine Empire, what's still left of it. And they go together.
So rather the crusade, the Pope in the West kind of merged with the Pope in the East. Crusade, and you said, as they were, I guess, coming across the lines, right?
Yeah, once they reached the borders of the Holy Land area, which would be somewhere probably outside of Antioch, that far north, and certainly by the time they got down as far as Damascus, it just becomes slaughter. They just kill everybody.
And you say anybody, even if they were...
Yeah, they don't even bother to ask, "Are you Christian, Jewish, Muslim?" I mean, there was a record of one group of devout Jewish people who were inside their synagogue when this part of this group arrived, and they just, the Crusaders barricaded the doors from the outside and set the place on fire. Everybody inside died. They were all devout Jewish people. They had nothing to do with the problem. But they sort of justified it in their own mind by saying, well, they're unbelievers anyway, so.
And this was around, you say,
1096, 1099, 1100. I always just sort of hang on to that 1100. That's a nice round number. And this is the first crusade. But they take the land and they actually set up a country, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with I believe an Englishman actually as the made the sort of the Lord Protector of that area. And it exists more or less, I think, for about 40 years, this independent country. And of course, these sites are just as holy, or in one way or another, to the Muslims as they are to the Christians, so they want it back. So it's going to lead to more crusades, attacks and counterattacks. And so there'll be 4 major crusades and many smaller ones over the next, 200 years from now, going back and forth over this land. When I was there in 2016, even the results of the Crusaders was everywhere. It was so great to see things like the Church of the Nativity, go to Bethlehem, go to Capernaum, see all that stuff. But just about everywhere you went, the guide would point out to us, oh, there's a Crusader castle over there. That was built in 11 something another. And it's still there. Go to Caesarea Maritima, the place where Herod the Great built a seaport for this country, and later Paul will be imprisoned for 2 years before he's transferred to Rome. They'll say, yeah, this is the part of Caesarea Maritima that dates from the New Testament time, but right over there, you see right across there's the Crusader castle. And that, it became one of the places where all the Crusader ships would come in, bringing more troops right in there and so forth. So just about everywhere you went, even at the Temple Mount itself, you have that western wall. But then when you come around to the south wall, you see the main south wall. But a lot of it looks kind of strange up there, and that's because it had been knocked down and put back up so many times during the Crusades, as one side held it as a fort while the other side attacked. Then things turned around, they held it while the other side attacked, and stones were knocked down and put back up, walls were built, all sorts of things. But one of the things I found particularly interesting while we were there, and I'll have maybe about time to play this before we take our break here, is on the north side of Jerusalem there is a church building standing almost completely intact today that was built by the Crusaders called St. Anne's Church. It's built right at the edge, or maybe actually over a little bit, of the New Testament pool of Bethesda or Bethsaida, place where Jesus healed the man, had been lame for 38 years, and he never had anyone, he said, to help him into the water when the water was stirred. That story. Well, this church building was built by the Crusaders during this period of time. What's so amazing about it is how well it's built and how well it stood. And when you go inside, it has almost perfect acoustics. How people living, 900 years ago without any of our modern marvels knew how to build a church building that was as amazing as this. I'll play you this very short video off of YouTube. Okay, that was 10 people singing without any amplification at the other end of the building from where the camera person is. And that was the same experience when our little group had the opportunity to go in there. They gave us the opportunity to sing, and we sing a hymn that was familiar to all of us, and it sounded like a whole congregation of people, and made us sound far better than any of us really were. Because it's just such it's just amazing, the architecture in there and so forth. And it's, after the Crusades, the Muslims recaptured that, and it became actually a school or a university run by Muslims up until the 15 or 1600s, I think, before it then was turned back over to Christians and is used as a church building and as not quite a holy site, but a place of interest for tourists even today. And it's all maintained by monks. They all wore white robes and Adidas tennis shoes or athletic shoes. And they bring people in, show you around, usher you out, bring the next group in. All right, let's take our break.